The new beginning. The Hales had been searching for the perfect home for years. James Hale, a recently appointed state prosecutor, and his wife, Michelle, had always dreamed of a life where work didn't overshadow family. They wanted a peaceful environment where their 2 children could grow up in safety and where family picnics and backyard games could become cherished traditions. After months of hunting, they found their dream home, a cozy house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets, friendly parks, and a reputation for safety. On moving day, James took a deep breath as he stood in the driveway, observing his new surroundings. He saw neighbors glancing at him, curious, maybe a bit worried, as they went about their routines. He offered a polite wave, trying to make a positive first impression. The reception was lukewarm at best. Some neighbors nodded back with reserved smiles, while others simply averted their gaze. Despite the mixed welcome, the Hales were excited. They unpacked their boxes, set up the children's rooms, and put family photos on the walls. That evening, as they gathered for dinner in their new kitchen, James spoke about the fresh start. "This is where we'll make memories," he said, smiling at Michelle and the kids. Little did he know that, to some neighbors, their arrival was not as welcome as he hoped. A few houses down, Tom Reynolds, a middle-aged man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, watched the Hales settle in with a growing sense of discomfort. Tom considered himself the unofficial protector of the community. He had seen families come and go, but this new family felt different. Tom had always prided himself on keeping the neighborhood safe and orderly. To him, the Hales represented a shift in the status quo, a change he wasn't sure he could trust. As days turned into weeks, Tom's unease about the Hales grew. His mind began to spin narratives fueled by his biases and fears. Who were these new people? Why did they choose this neighborhood? And most importantly, why did they have visitors, other black men, coming to their home occasionally? Each time Tom passed by and saw James, he felt a tightening in his chest, a voice in his mind warning him that something was amiss. James, unaware of the suspicions brewing, threw himself into his new community, determined to create a peaceful life for his family. He greeted his neighbors warmly, offered a helping hand to those who needed it, and even attended a local neighborhood association meeting to introduce himself. However, Tom saw these actions through a skewed lens, interpreting them as an invasion rather than an integration. James's friendly approach seemed insincere to Tom, who believed the prosecutor's profession made him automatically detached and untrustworthy. The first sign of trouble came one afternoon when Tom saw James on a work call in his driveway. He was animated, speaking passionately into his phone, his brow furrowed with concentration. To anyone else, it would look like a man absorbed in his work. But to Tom, it was something suspicious, a possible sign that James was up to no good. In his mind, a man who didn't fit in was likely hiding something, and he convinced himself that James's presence was a threat to the peaceful order he held dear. Later that evening, Tom saw a group of men visit the Hale house. They were friends of James from law school, stopping by for a housewarming celebration. They laughed, joked, and shared stories on the back patio, enjoying the cool night air. But Tom's suspicions deepened. He thought, why are there so many of them? And why do they seem so comfortable here? In his mind, Tom began painting James and his friends as something they were not: troublemakers, outsiders, and even threats. Driven by a sense of self-appointed duty, Tom started to keep a closer watch on the Hale household. He would walk his dog by their house more frequently, subtly glancing at the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of what he thought might be incriminating behavior. His wife, noticing his growing obsession, tried to calm him. "Tom, they're just a nice family trying to settle in. Give them a chance," she said, but her words fell on deaf ears. Tom was too far into his narrative, convinced he was the only one who could see the truth about the Hales. As the days passed, Tom's suspicions turned into a sort of mission. He began keeping notes, jotting down the comings and goings of the Hale residence, the cars parked in front of their house, the people who visited, and even the times when their lights were on late at night. To him, these observations confirmed his fears that James was hiding something. He just didn't know what yet. One night, Tom saw James and his family hosting a small gathering. They had invited a few friends over for a barbecue, and the sounds of laughter and cheerful conversation floated through the evening air. Instead of seeing a family enjoying their new home, Tom saw a disturbance, a violation of the quiet he associated with his neighborhood. The sight of unfamiliar faces, friends of the Hales, only fueled his prejudice. Unable to contain himself any longer, Tom decided to take action. He paced around his living room, torn between wanting to confront James himself and wanting to involve the authorities. His heart pounded as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he decided that calling the police was his best course of action. After all, he reasoned, if his suspicions were correct, he was potentially saving the neighborhood from something dangerous. With a shaky hand, Tom picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Hello, I'd like to report some suspicious activity in my neighborhood," he said, his voice tinged with a self-righteous resolve. He described the Hales in vague, negative terms, emphasizing the unusual visitors and the expensive cars parked outside their home. He hinted at his fears without outright accusations, letting the dispatcher fill in the gaps with imagined crimes. "They're different," he added, his tone suggesting a threat without directly saying it. The dispatcher listened politely, noting Tom's concerns, but she had no concrete reason to escalate the situation. Nonetheless, she assured him that a patrol car would drive by to check on the suspicious activity. Satisfied that he had taken the right steps, Tom hung up, unaware of the consequences his call would set into motion. At that same moment, James was inside with his family, blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing just a few doors down. He was telling his kids a bedtime story, his wife by his side, feeling the happiness he had longed for. Little did he know that outside his window, flashing lights would soon disrupt their peaceful evening, bringing his family face to face with the reality of prejudice in the place they had hoped to call home. The unfolding suspicion. The next morning, the tranquility of the neighborhood was disrupted by the flash of red and blue lights outside the Hale residence. A police cruiser had arrived, responding to the vague concerns expressed by Tom Reynolds. Tom, peeking through his living room curtains, watched as the officers stepped out of the car. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was finally going to get confirmation of his suspicions, or so he thought. Inside the house, James was tying his tie, preparing for another day at the courthouse. He noticed the flashing lights from the corner of his eye and felt a wave of confusion wash over him. At first, he thought perhaps there had been an accident on the street, or maybe the officers were simply patrolling. But as he walked to the window, he realized the police car was parked directly in front of his house. His wife, Michelle, noticed his sudden silence. "What's wrong, James?" she asked, her voice filled with concern as she followed his gaze. "I'm not sure," he replied, trying to mask his unease. "But it looks like the police are here." Their children, a boy and a girl, ran to the window, excited by the unexpected scene. "Are they here to catch a bad guy?" asked their son, his eyes wide with curiosity. James forced a reassuring smile. "No, buddy, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." But deep down, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable feeling that had begun to gnaw at him. Being a state prosecutor, James was no stranger to law enforcement, but this was different. This felt personal, intrusive. Taking a deep breath, he stepped outside, trying to maintain a composed demeanor. The officers, noticing his approach, immediately straightened, exchanging glances as they took in his appearance. A tall, confident black man in an expensive suit. One of the officers, Officer Miller, spoke up first. "Good morning, sir. We received a report of suspicious activity at this address," he said, his tone a mix of professionalism and guarded skepticism. "Suspicious activity?" James repeated, unable to hide the incredulity in his voice. "This is my home. I live here with my wife and kids. I'm not sure what could be considered suspicious about that." The second officer, Officer Bryant, shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the situation was escalating into something neither of them had anticipated. "We were told that there were unusual visitors and cars parked outside," he explained, though he avoided direct eye contact with James. James took a moment to process the information, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. He knew what this was about. He had seen it play out too many times before in courtrooms and news stories. But to experience it firsthand, in his own neighborhood, was something he hadn't expected. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Michelle standing at the door, watching anxiously. "Officers, I'm the state prosecutor. I work with law enforcement every day," he said, trying to keep his tone even. "This is my family's home. I don't know who would consider us a threat, but I assure you, we're just here to live in peace." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly taken aback by the revelation. They hadn't expected this man to be someone of authority, someone who worked within the same system they served. Officer Miller cleared his throat, a hint of embarrassment creeping into his expression. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Hale. We're just following up on a report." James nodded, though he couldn't hide the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. You're just doing your job," he said, but the bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. He had always believed in justice and the importance of protecting communities, but in that moment he felt the sting of prejudice. Prejudice that painted him and his family as different, as suspects simply for being who they were. The officers mumbled another apology before retreating to their cruiser, visibly uncomfortable. James stood on the porch, watching as they drove away, feeling a knot of anger tightening in his chest. He had worked his entire life to break through barriers, to prove himself in a system that wasn't built for people like him. And yet, here he was, facing the same discrimination he fought against every day. Back inside, Michelle looked at him with a mixture of concern and sympathy. "James, what happened? Why did they come?" "It seems we're not as welcome here as we thought," he replied, trying to mask the frustration in his voice for the sake of his kids, who were watching them intently. "Someone must have thought we didn't belong in this neighborhood." Michelle sighed, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We knew there might be some resistance, but I didn't think it would happen so soon, and certainly not like this." James forced a smile, trying to reassure her. "It's fine, Michelle. We'll handle it. We've dealt with worse." But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was only the beginning. If someone was willing to call the police on them without reason, what else would they do to make their lives difficult? Meanwhile, across the street, Tom Reynolds watched the entire scene unfold from his living room window, a smug sense of satisfaction filling him. He had no idea James was a state prosecutor. He had simply seen him as an outsider, someone who didn't fit the image of his neighborhood. And now, seeing the police arrive and question James had only confirmed his suspicions in his own mind. To Tom, this was proof that he was right to be cautious, right to protect his community from people who didn't belong. But as he continued watching, Tom noticed something he hadn't expected. Instead of looking defeated or fearful, James stood tall, exuding an air of dignity and confidence that seemed to defy the situation. Tom felt a twinge of doubt, an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite identify. But he quickly brushed it aside, reassuring himself that he had done the right thing. Later that evening, James sat down with Michelle in the quiet of their living room, the children finally asleep upstairs. He recounted the interaction with the officers, the subtle insinuations, the questions that were asked without words. Michelle listened, her face a mixture of empathy and anger. "We moved here to escape this kind of treatment, to give our kids a peaceful life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And now, our own neighbors see us as a threat, just because of the color of our skin." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's more than that. It's the idea that we don't fit into their world. They're used to seeing people who look like them, think like them, live like them. And anyone who challenges that image is seen as an intruder, an outsider." Michelle looked down, her hands clenched into fists. "So what do we do? Just ignore it? Pretend it doesn't hurt?" "No," James replied, a steely resolve in his voice. "We're not going to pretend it doesn't hurt, but we're also not going to let it chase us out. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let someone's small-mindedness dictate where my family can or can't live. We belong here, and we're not going anywhere." Over the next few days, James made a point of being visible in the neighborhood. He took his children to the park, greeted his neighbors, and even waved at Tom when he saw him walking his dog. He was determined to show that he was just as much a part of this community as anyone else, that he and his family were here to stay. Tom, however, continued to watch James with a wary eye. He noticed that his neighbors were beginning to warm up to the Hales, exchanging friendly nods and brief conversations. Some of them even commented on how polite and respectful James and his family were, how they were a positive addition to the community. This only fueled Tom's resentment. To him, these gestures were betrayals, signs that his neighbors were forgetting what he saw as the values of their neighborhood. In his mind, Tom began crafting new narratives, convincing himself that James's friendly demeanor was just a facade, a cover for whatever agenda he believed the Hales had. Each time he saw James smiling and talking with other neighbors, his suspicions grew, morphing into something darker, something irrational. He was convinced that he was the only one who saw the truth, the only one who could protect the community from whatever threat he imagined James represented. Unbeknownst to James and Michelle, Tom was preparing to take matters into his own hands once again, determined to expose the Hales for who he thought they were. Little did he know, his actions would soon backfire, unraveling his own life in ways he could never have anticipated. The unseen burden. James and Michelle were settling into their new routine, but the incident with the police hung over them like a dark cloud. Every time James stepped out of the house, he felt the weight of judgmental eyes, the silent scrutiny of neighbors who saw him as different, as an outsider. It was a burden he carried quietly, not wanting to worry his family, but Michelle sensed it. She could see it in the slight tension in his shoulders, in the way he would pause for a second before leaving the house, as if steeling himself for another encounter with prejudice. One afternoon, as James was working on a case at home, Michelle decided to address the elephant in the room. She made 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at the dining table. "James," she began softly, "I know you're trying to protect us, but you don't have to shoulder all of this alone." James looked up from his laptop, surprised by her insight. He had always prided himself on being strong, on carrying his responsibilities without complaint, but Michelle knew him too well. He sighed, setting his pen down. "It's just hard, Michelle. I'm used to dealing with hostility at work, with people who judge me before they even know me. But here, in our own neighborhood, it's like they're waiting for me to slip up, to prove that I don't belong." Michelle reached across the table, taking his hand. "This isn't just about you, James. It's about all of us. We moved here because we wanted a better life for our kids, a place where they could feel safe. But how can we teach them to be proud of who they are if we're constantly hiding from this hostility?" Her words hit home, and James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "You're right. We're not going to let a few narrow-minded people dictate how we live our lives. We'll show them who we are, not by hiding, but by being our true selves." With that resolve, the Hales decided to embrace their new community even more openly. They attended neighborhood events, engaged in small talk with anyone willing to chat, and even volunteered at the local park cleanup day. Slowly, they began to make connections. Some neighbors, seeing their genuine kindness and integrity, started warming up to them. The children, too, made friends and began to feel at home. But for Tom Reynolds, each friendly interaction between the Hales and other residents felt like a personal betrayal. He had spent years building a network of trust within the neighborhood, cultivating a sense of unity based on shared values and appearances. To him, the Hales represented an intrusion, a challenge to the order he had worked so hard to maintain. And the worst part, his neighbors were welcoming them with open arms. Tom's bitterness grew, festering like a wound. Each time he saw James talking to a neighbor, sharing a laugh, or playing with his kids, he felt a surge of resentment. In his mind, James was manipulating everyone, putting on a friendly act to mask his true intentions. Tom became increasingly obsessed, spending hours watching the Hales house, jotting down notes about their activities, even scrutinizing the visitors who stopped by. One evening, Tom's wife, Sandra, noticed him standing by the window, peering through the blinds. She sighed, exasperated by his behavior. This wasn't the first time she'd seen him consumed by his suspicions, but this time it was different. His fixation on the Hales had become all-consuming, affecting not only his mood but their marriage. "Tom, you're obsessed," she said, crossing her arms. "This isn't healthy. You're turning our lives upside down over a family that hasn't done a single thing to harm us." Tom didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the Hales house, where James and Michelle were setting up a small barbecue in their backyard. "You don't understand, Sandra," he replied, his voice tight with conviction. "I know what I'm seeing. They don't belong here. They're up to something, I can feel it." Sandra shook her head, frustrated. "What are you talking about? They're just a family trying to live their lives, just like us. You're letting your paranoia control you. Why can't you just give them a chance?" Tom finally turned to face her, his expression hard. "You don't see what I see. They don't fit in here. People like them bring trouble. I'm just trying to keep our communities safe." Sandra stared at him, a mixture of sadness and disappointment in her eyes. "People like them? Do you even hear yourself, Tom? This isn't about safety. This is about your own fears and biases. You're pushing people away because they don't look like you. Is that the kind of person you want to be?" Her words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Tom looked unsure, as if grappling with the reality of his actions, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he scoffed, waving her off. "You'll see, Sandra. They'll slip up sooner or later. And when they do, don't say I didn't warn you." Sandra watched him walk away, feeling a pang of sorrow. She loved Tom, but his fixation on the Hales was tearing their family apart. She wondered how much longer she could stand by and watch him spiral into a cycle of hatred and fear. Meanwhile, James and Michelle were blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding just a few doors down. That evening, they invited a few friends over for a small gathering, hoping to introduce themselves to more neighbors. They set up a grill in the backyard, put on some music, and spent the evening laughing and sharing stories. Their kids played with the other children, their laughter filling the air. To anyone passing by, it was a heartwarming scene, a family embracing their community, building new friendships. But to Tom, watching from his window, it was a threat, a reminder that he was losing control over his neighborhood. In his mind, the Hales were infiltrating his world, winning over his neighbors, one by one. Fueled by frustration, Tom decided he couldn't wait any longer. He was going to confront James, to demand answers and expose him for who he believed he truly was. Tom's heart raced as he marched across the street, his fists clenched, his face a mask of determination. He had no concrete plan, no evidence of wrongdoing, just a conviction that he was right and that he needed to protect his community. As he approached the Hales' backyard, the laughter and chatter faded, replaced by a tense silence. James noticed Tom's approach and stood up, a look of polite curiosity on his face. He had seen Tom around, but they had never exchanged more than a brief nod. Now, standing face to face, James sensed the hostility radiating from his neighbor. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice calm and measured. Tom didn't bother with pleasantries. "I want to know what you're doing here," he said, his tone accusatory. "Why did you move into this neighborhood? What's your agenda?" The question took James by surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "My agenda," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I moved here with my family to have a peaceful life, just like you." Tom scoffed, crossing his arms. "Don't play innocent with me. I've seen the people who come to your house. I know you're not like the rest of us." James felt a surge of anger, but held it in check. He knew better than to engage in a confrontation, especially in front of his friends and family. I'm sorry if our presence makes you uncomfortable, Tom, but we have as much right to be here as anyone else. Tom took a step closer, his voice lowering to a threatening tone. You think you can just waltz in here and change everything? I know what people like you bring. Crime, disorder, trouble. I won't let you ruin this neighborhood. The weight of Tom's words hung in the air, charged with prejudice and irrational fear. James took a deep breath, feeling the anger simmering beneath his calm facade. He wanted to lash out, to tell Tom exactly what he thought of his narrow-minded views, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, he took the high road. I'm sorry you feel that way, Tom, he replied, his voice firm but respectful. But I'm not here to ruin anything. My family and I are here to live our lives, just like you. And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's time you look at your own issues instead of blaming others. With that, James turned and walked away, leaving Tom standing in stunned silence. The gathering resumed, though a shadow of tension lingered. James felt a sense of triumph mixed with sadness. He knew he had taken the right stance, but he also knew that Tom's prejudice ran deep, and it wouldn't disappear overnight. Across the yard, Michelle gave him a reassuring smile, silently expressing her pride in his restraint. She knew it hadn't been easy for him to face such blatant discrimination, but she also knew that James was a man of integrity, a man who refused to be dragged down by hatred. As the evening wore on, Tom sunk back to his house, feeling a hollow emptiness gnawing at him. He had confronted James, but instead of feeling victorious, he felt defeated. His words, his accusations, his attempts to intimidate, none of it had fazed James. In fact, it only highlighted his own insecurity, his own inability to accept change. Tom was beginning to realize that his prejudice was not a source of strength, but a weight dragging him down, isolating him from the very community he claimed to protect. The turning point. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of Tom's confrontation with James lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Neighbors had whispered about it, some shaken by Tom's blatant hostility, others quietly supportive of James and his family. It seemed that Tom's prejudice had not only failed to isolate the Hales, but had inadvertently sparked conversations within the community about tolerance, acceptance, and the subtle biases that lingered beneath the neighborhood's picturesque surface. Yet for Tom, the encounter had only deepened his resentment. He avoided eye contact with his neighbors, sensing their judgment in every glance and polite smile. He felt as though the very ground beneath him was shifting, his familiar neighborhood slipping out of his control. At night, he lay awake, replaying the confrontation in his mind, bitter and restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that James had exposed something in him, something ugly that he didn't want to acknowledge. Sandra, his wife, had also grown distant. She was a patient woman, tolerant of Tom's quirks and protective nature, but this obsession had gone too far. One evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, she finally spoke up, her voice trembling with frustration. Tom, you've changed, she said, her eyes fixed on her plate. This isn't the man I married. I don't understand why you're so threatened by the Hales. They're good people, anyone can see that. Tom clenched his jaw, feeling a familiar surge of defensiveness. Good people, he scoffed. You don't know them like I do. I'm telling you, Sandra, there's something they're hiding. People like that don't just move into a neighborhood like ours without a reason. Sandra's eyes met his, filled with disappointment. People like that, she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. Listen to yourself, Tom. You sound like a stranger. You're so caught up in your fears that you can't see what's right in front of you. You're losing us, Tom. You're losing me. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the hurt in her eyes silenced him. For the first time, he realized that his actions were pushing away the one person who had always stood by him, through every high and low. And yet, his pride wouldn't let him admit that he was wrong. Instead, he retreated further into his bitterness, shutting her out, convinced that he was doing the right thing, even if it cost him his family. Meanwhile, the Hales were adjusting to life in the neighborhood, doing their best to rise above the hostility they faced. Despite Tom's open animosity, they had found allies among their neighbors, people who saw beyond skin color, beyond stereotypes, and recognized them as a loving family simply trying to live in peace. One Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood held a community picnic at the local park, a cherished tradition meant to bring everyone together. The Hales decided to attend, eager to strengthen their bonds with the supportive families they had met. James knew that Tom would likely be there, but he was determined not to let one man's prejudice spoil the day for his family. As they arrived, the children ran off to play with the other kids, their laughter echoing across the park. Michelle smiled, watching them with a sense of contentment. James squeezed her hand, silently grateful for her strength and resilience. Together, they made their way to the picnic area, where tables were set up with food, drinks, and games for the kids. Tom, already seated at one of the tables, noticed their arrival and felt a pang of irritation. He had hoped they wouldn't come, that they'd feel unwelcome and stay away. But instead, there they were, smiling, engaging with everyone as if they truly belonged. He watched as his neighbors greeted James and Michelle warmly, some even exchanging hugs and laughter. It was as if his own views had become obsolete, his influence over the neighborhood fading. Unable to contain his frustration, Tom decided to distance himself, muttering a half-hearted excuse to Sandra as he wandered over to a quieter part of the park. He sat on a bench, stewing in his resentment, his thoughts circling back to all the imagined slights and threats he believed the Hales represented. In his mind, he was the victim, the man who had sacrificed so much to protect his community, only to be cast aside. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he was joined by an elderly man, Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood for as long as Tom could remember. Mr. Thompson was known for his quiet wisdom, a man who had seen the neighborhood evolve over the decades. He had witnessed changes, both good and bad, but he had always embraced them with grace. "Mind if I sit here, Tom?" Mr. Thompson asked, easing himself onto the bench beside him. Tom nodded, not particularly in the mood for company, but too polite to refuse. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the families mingling at the picnic. Then Mr. Thompson spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I've noticed you've been struggling lately, Tom. You don't seem like yourself." Tom stiffened, his defenses immediately rising. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson. Just tired of all the changes around here. It's not the same neighborhood I remember." Mr. Thompson chuckled, a gentle sound filled with understanding. "Change is hard, isn't it? But it's also a part of life. We can't stop it, no matter how much we may want to." Tom's jaw tightened, and he glanced away, his gaze fixed on the distant figures of James and his family. "It's not just change, Mr. Thompson. It's them. They don't belong here. They're different. They bring a different kind of energy, and I don't trust it." Mr. Thompson followed his gaze, his eyes settling on the Hales. After a moment, he looked back at Tom, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I used to think like that once. Back when I was young and thought I knew everything about the world. But life has a way of humbling us, of teaching us that we're all more alike than we think." Tom frowned, feeling the sting of those words. "I'm just trying to protect this neighborhood, to keep it safe." "Safe from what?" Mr. Thompson asked gently. "From people who look different? We come from different backgrounds." "Tom, I've watched the Hales. They're a kind, respectful family. They're raising their kids with good values, just like you raised yours. Isn't that what matters?" Tom shifted uncomfortably, struggling to articulate his fears. "It's not just that. I don't know them. They don't understand what this place means to me." Mr. Thompson sighed, a sadness in his gaze. "Tom, I've known you for years. You're a good man, but sometimes we let our fears get the best of us. We hold on to things so tightly that we end up hurting the very people we care about. Don't let that happen to you, Tom. Don't let your fear rob you of peace." Tom didn't respond, but his mind was racing. A part of him wanted to reject Mr. Thompson's words, to cling to his anger and distrust. But another part of him, the part that remembered a younger, more open-minded version of himself, felt a pang of shame. He knew that he was on the brink of losing his wife, his friends, and even his own sense of integrity. But admitting he was wrong was a step he wasn't sure he was ready to take. As he sat there, struggling with his inner turmoil, the picnic continued around him. He watched as James and Michelle laughed with other families, as the children played games together, unburdened by the weight of prejudice. It was a scene of unity, of a community embracing diversity, and it stirred something within him. A realization that perhaps he was the one who didn't fit in anymore, that his views had become relics of a time long past. Back at the picnic, Sandra was speaking with Michelle, who had noticed Tom's absence. "I hope everything is okay with Tom," Michelle said gently, her voice filled with genuine concern. "We don't want to cause any trouble. We just want to be part of this community." Sandra forced a smile, touched by Michelle's kindness. "I know, Michelle, and I'm so sorry for everything. Tom, he's struggling. He's not himself these days, but I hope, with time, he'll come around." Michelle nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "Change is hard, but we're here, and we're not going anywhere. I just hope he knows that we're not a threat. We're just a family trying to find a place to belong." Sandra felt a swell of gratitude for Michelle's compassion, a compassion that was helping her see her husband's actions in a new light. She realized that perhaps the real threat to their community wasn't the Hales, but the walls of fear and prejudice that had been built over the years. As the picnic wound down, Tom finally returned, his face pale and his demeanor subdued. Sandra noticed a change in him, sensing that something had shifted during his conversation with Mr. Thompson. She didn't press in for details, but as they walked home in silence, she took his hand, offering him a quiet reassurance that she was still there, that she was willing to stand by him if he was willing to change. That night, Tom lay awake, haunted by Mr. Thompson's words and the image of James's family, smiling and laughing with the neighbors he once called his friends. He was beginning to understand that his fight wasn't with the Hales or with change. It was with himself, with the fears and insecurities that had twisted his sense of right and wrong. For the first time, Tom felt the weight of his actions, the burden of the prejudice he had carried for so long. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that he had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not only his future, but the future of his family and the neighborhood he held so dear. The unraveling of old beliefs. The following morning, Tom woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. It was a mix of restlessness, regret, and an unsettling sense of emptiness. For the first time, he saw his life through a different lens, stripped of the assumptions and prejudices that had once colored his perspective. His conversation with Mr. Thompson had awakened something in him, a nagging awareness that he was standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice he could no longer avoid. He lingered over his coffee, his thoughts racing. His wife, Sandra, had noticed the change in him. She watched him quietly, giving him space, but also sensing that this was a pivotal moment for their family. For years, she had been patient, hoping that Tom would one day see beyond his fears and insecurities. And now, it seemed, that day had finally arrived. "Tom," she said gently, breaking the silence. "You know, you don't have to do this alone. If you're willing to change, I'm here for you. But it's up to you to take the first step." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "I know, Sandra. I know I've been difficult. I've pushed you away, and I've let my fears control me. I just don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to let go of these beliefs I've held onto for so long." Sandra reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You start by letting yourself see people for who they are, not for what you think they represent. James and his family aren't your enemies. They're just people, like us, trying to live their lives. Maybe it's time you give them a chance." Tom nodded, her words sinking in. But the thought of facing James, of admitting he was wrong, filled him with dread. He had spent so long building an image of himself as a protector of the neighborhood, a man who knew what was best. To confront the truth, that he had been wrong, that his actions had hurt innocent people, was almost unbearable, and yet he knew that if he didn't, he would lose everything he held dear: his marriage, his friendships, and even his own self-respect. That afternoon, Tom made a decision. He was going to apologize to James. He didn't know how the conversation would go, or if James would even be willing to listen, but he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, he walked across the street, feeling a weight in his chest with every step. It was the longest walk he had ever taken. When he reached the Hales' front door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. A part of him wanted to turn back, to retreat to the comfort of his own home and pretend that nothing had changed. But he pushed through the fear, reminding himself of the man he wanted to be, the man Sandra believed he could become. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. Moments later, the door opened, and James stood there, his expression one of surprise. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, the air thick with tension. "Tom," James said, his tone cautious, "can I help you?" Tom cleared his throat, striving to find the right words. "James, I wanted to talk to you, if you're willing to listen." James raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "All right," he said, stepping aside and gesturing for Tom to enter. Inside, Tom noticed the warmth of the home, the family photos on the walls, the toys scattered on the floor, the scent of a home-cooked meal lingering in the air. It was a stark contrast to the image he had built in his mind of James as an outsider, a threat. For the first time, he saw the Hales as a family, not as strangers, but as people with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. James led him to the living room, where they sat down, an awkward silence settling between them. Tom fidgeted, feeling out of place, as if he didn't belong in this home he had spent so long viewing with suspicion. "I don't know where to begin," Tom admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I've been wrong, James. I've been wrong about a lot of things." James watched him, his expression unreadable, but there was a hint of empathy in his gaze. "Go on," he said quietly, giving Tom the space to speak. Tom took a deep breath, forcing himself to confront the painful truth. "When you and your family moved in, I felt threatened. I thought you were going to change everything I loved about this neighborhood. I let my fears get the best of me, and I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing by keeping an eye on you." He paused, his voice shaking. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but I genuinely believed I was protecting this place. I thought I was protecting my family, my community. But the truth is, I was only protecting myself from change, from my own insecurities. And I'm sorry, James. I'm truly sorry for the way I've treated you and your family." James listened, his face thoughtful. For a moment, he didn't respond, and Tom felt his heart sink, fearing that his apology would be met with rejection. But then James spoke, his tone calm and steady. "Tom, I appreciate you coming here and saying this. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially about something so deeply ingrained. I understand that change can be difficult, and I don't hold it against you for struggling with it. But you need to understand that my family and I are just trying to live our lives. We're not here to disrupt anything. We just want to be part of this community, just like anyone else." Tom nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. "I know that now, and I want to make it right if you'll let me." James considered this for a moment before giving him a slight nod. "We all make mistakes, Tom. What matters is that we learn from them. If you're willing to make an effort, I'm willing to give you a chance." Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a feeling of redemption that he hadn't thought possible. He stood up, offering his hand to James, who shook it firmly. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a bridge between two men who had once seen each other as enemies, but now stood on the path to understanding. As Tom left the Hale residence, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had a long way to go. That trust wasn't something he could earn overnight. But he was determined to show James, and the rest of the neighborhood, that he was willing to change, to let go of the fears and prejudices that had once defined him. Over the next few weeks, Tom began to rebuild his relationships, not only with James but with the entire community. He volunteered at local events, engaged in conversations with neighbors he had once avoided, and even invited the Hales over for dinner. Sandra, seeing the changes in him, felt a sense of hope, a belief that their marriage and their community could heal from the wounds that prejudice had inflicted. One day, Tom found himself at the park, watching the children play. James was there with his own kids, laughing as they chased each other around the playground. Tom approached him, and they exchanged a friendly nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. "You know, Tom," James said, breaking the silence, "I used to believe that people couldn't change. That prejudice was something too deeply rooted to overcome, but you've shown me that change is possible, and I want you to know that I respect that." Tom felt a lump in his throat, grateful for the forgiveness he had been given. "Thank you, James. I won't take it for granted. I've learned a lot from you and your family. You've shown me a kindness I didn't deserve, and I'm grateful for that." They stood there in silence, watching their children play together, a symbol of the unity that had once seemed impossible. For Tom, this was the culmination of his journey, a journey that had forced him to confront his own fears, his own biases, and had ultimately led him to a place of understanding. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to feel like a true community, a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. Tom became an advocate for inclusivity, encouraging others to open their hearts and minds, just as he had done. He shared his story with others, hoping that his experience could inspire change, that his mistakes could serve as a lesson in empathy and growth. The Hales, too, found a renewed sense of belonging, knowing that they had not only found a home, but had helped to transform a community. They had turned a place of suspicion and prejudice into a place of unity and acceptance, a place where their children could grow up feeling valued and respected. And as for Tom, he discovered a peace he hadn't known in years. A peace born not from control, but from acceptance, from letting go of the fears that had once held him captive. He had faced his darkest impulses, confronted the man he had become, and emerged on the other side a better person, a man who now understood the true meaning of community. Looking back, he realized that the Hales hadn't changed the neighborhood. They had changed him, and for that, he would be forever grateful. A community transformed. Months had passed since Tom's heartfelt apology to James, and in that time, the neighborhood had undergone a quiet but powerful transformation. What had once been a place where unspoken prejudices lurked beneath the surface was now evolving into a community that embraced change, diversity, and understanding. Tom's journey had not only reshaped his own life, but had rippled out to touch the lives of everyone around him. For Tom, the process of unlearning his biases was not immediate. It was a daily commitment, a choice he made every morning when he looked in the mirror and resolved to be a better man than he had been the day before. There were moments when old habits crept in, when fear and suspicion threatened to cloud his mind. But each time, he reminded himself of the pain he had caused, the harm he had inflicted, and he chose compassion instead. One chilly autumn afternoon, the neighborhood organized a block party. It was an annual event, but this year it felt different. There was a new energy, a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. Tom had been one of the organizers, working alongside James and other neighbors to bring the event to life. He had thrown himself into the work with a passion, seeing it as an opportunity to give back, to rebuild the trust he had broken. As he set up tables and strung lights along the street, he marveled at how much had changed. Neighbors he had once known only in passing were now friends, people he could laugh and share stories with. He had learned so much from them, discovering the richness in their diverse backgrounds, traditions, and perspectives. For the first time in his life, he felt part of something greater than himself, a true community where everyone belonged. The Hales arrived at the block party with their children in tow, carrying a tray of Michelle's homemade cookies. James and Tom exchanged a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on together. Sandra, who had stood by Tom through every struggle, smiled as she watched the two men talking. She felt a swell of pride in her husband, knowing how hard he had worked to overcome his fears and prejudices. As the party got underway, Children raced up and down the street, laughing and playing without a care. Neighbors mingled, sharing food and stories, bridging the gaps that had once divided them. At one point, James took the microphone to welcome everyone, thanking them for coming together to make the event a success. "We're here today because of each and every one of you," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "When my family and I moved here, we didn't know what to expect. We hoped to find a place where we could belong, where our children could grow up surrounded by kindness and acceptance. And I'm grateful to say that this neighborhood has become exactly that. We are proud to call this place our home, and we are proud to call all of you our neighbors." The crowd erupted in applause, and James handed the microphone to Tom, who had been standing beside him. Tom hesitated, feeling a lump in his throat. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he knew he had something important to say. Clearing his throat, he looked out at the faces of his neighbors, some of whom he had hurt, others who had forgiven him, and all who had witnessed his journey. "Thank you, James," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. I need to say something to all of you. I need to apologize for the way I acted when the Hales moved in. I let my fears get the best of me, and I made assumptions about them that were wrong. I thought I was protecting this neighborhood, but the truth is, I was only hurting it. I hurt this community, and I hurt a family who deserved nothing but kindness." He paused, taking a breath as he gathered his thoughts. "I can't undo the mistakes I made, but I can promise to do better. I'm working on myself, trying to let go of the old beliefs that held me back, and I want to thank each of you for your patience, your forgiveness, and for teaching me what it means to be a true neighbor. This community has shown me that we're stronger together, that our differences make us richer, not weaker." The crowd was silent, absorbing his words. Then, one by one, people began to clap, the applause growing until it filled the street. Tom felt tears prickling his eyes, overwhelmed by the support and acceptance he had been given. In that moment, he knew he had finally found peace, not just with his neighbors, but with himself. After his speech, he stepped down from the makeshift stage and was immediately met by James, who extended his hand with a warm smile. Tom took it, shaking firmly, and for the first time, he felt the barriers between them completely dissolve. "Thank you, Tom," James said quietly. "It takes a lot of courage to stand up and admit you were wrong. I respect that." Tom nodded, unable to find the right words. He was grateful, humbled, and determined to honor the second chance he had been given. As the evening wore on, Tom and Sandra found themselves mingling with the Hales and other families, sharing food and laughter. The children put on a little talent show, dancing and singing with the unabashed joy that only children possess. It was a simple thing, but for Tom, it was a reminder of everything he had almost lost: friendship, community, and a sense of belonging. Later that night, as the party was winding down, Tom sat beside Mr. Thompson, who had been watching the festivities with a satisfied smile. "Looks like you finally found your place, Tom," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes twinkling with wisdom. Tom nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I have, and I have you to thank for that. If you hadn't called me out, I don't know if I would have ever seen the truth." Mr. Thompson chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "Sometimes, all we need is a little nudge to see what's right in front of us. But the real work, that was all you. It's not easy to confront our own flaws. But you did it, Tom, and I'm proud of you." Tom looked out at the street, now littered with the remnants of the block party, plates, cups, and confetti scattered everywhere, signs of a night filled with laughter and joy. He thought about the path he had traveled, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. It had been a painful journey, but he knew it had led him to a better place, a place of understanding and compassion. In the days that followed, Tom continued to deepen his relationships with his neighbors. He organized neighborhood events, volunteered at local charities, and made a point of getting to know each family, learning about their cultures, their stories, and their dreams. He had discovered a newfound purpose in building connections and fostering unity, a purpose that filled his days with meaning and fulfillment. James and Michelle became close friends of Tom and Sandra, and their families often spent time together, sharing meals and celebrating milestones. The Hales had become more than just neighbors. They were family, bonded by a shared experience that had transformed them all. One evening, as Tom sat on his porch, watching the sunset with Sandra by his side, he felt a profound sense of contentment. He had spent so many years trying to keep change at bay, but now he saw change as a gift, an opportunity to grow and to open his heart to new possibilities. "I never thought I'd be here," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I never thought I could change this much." Sandra smiled, squeezing his hand. "I always knew you could. It just took you a little longer to see it." Tom chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had spent so much of his life afraid of the unknown, of people who were different, of a world that was constantly evolving. But now he felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the Hales, for his neighbors, and for the journey that had led him to this moment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Tom knew that he had finally come home. Not to a place, but to a new version of himself, a version that was open, accepting, and unafraid. And in the quiet of that evening, surrounded by the people he loved, Tom made a silent vow to continue growing, to keep his heart open, and to honor the lesson he had learned. That true community isn't about keeping people out. It's about inviting them in, embracing them, and celebrating the beauty that each person brings. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought him to a place of peace, a place of love, a place where he knew he belonged. And as he sat there, watching the lights flicker on in the homes around him, he felt a profound sense of hope for himself, for his community, and for a future that was now brighter than ever.